The pandemic was supposed to change Catholic pilgrimage forever. For a time, it looked like it had. Pilgrimage routes fell quiet, international travel collapsed, and some of the world's most famous Catholic shrines lost the crowds that had filled them for generations. But 5 years later, the numbers are telling a very different story. Fatima welcomed around 6.5 million people in 2025, surpassing its pre-pandemic benchmark. Aparecida drew roughly 10.5 million pilgrims in the same year, with attendance rising about 15%. Lourdes has seen millions return, while major pilgrimage routes across Europe are drawing record numbers of walkers from around the world. And the deeper you look, the more surprising the pattern becomes. This is not simply a story about crowds coming back. Some pilgrimage centers are reaching new highs, some are attracting more international visitors, and others are seeing traditional forms of pilgrimage return with unexpected strength. The question is no longer whether Catholic pilgrimage survived the pandemic. The real question is where it is growing fastest, how much it is growing, and what these numbers reveal about the changing face of Catholic pilgrimage. These are 10 places where the numbers are impossible to ignore. Subscribe to the channel and let's begin. Number 10. Jasna, Góra, Poland. The strange thing about Jasna, Góra is that its revival cannot be measured by people simply showing up. It can be heard in footsteps. Every year, thousands of pilgrims leave their homes and begin walking towards Santiago, sometimes spending days or even weeks on the road. They carry backpacks instead of suitcases, prayer intentions instead of itineraries, and often arrive exhausted long before they reach the monastery. Yet after the disruption of the pandemic, this ancient pilgrimage tradition has been returning with striking force. In 2025, Jasna, Góra welcomed more than 4.2 million pilgrims. That number had risen sharply from roughly 2.5 million in 2022 and 3.6 million in 2023. It still remains slightly below the approximately 4.4 million recorded in 2019. So this is not a story about an all-time record. The more revealing story is the speed and scale of the recovery. Then, the numbers take a different shape. Between May and September, more than 108,000 people reached Jasna, Góra through organized walking, cycling, running, roller skating, and horseback pilgrimages. More than 97,000 walked. Some groups traveled more than 600 miles over nearly 3 weeks, turning distance, exhaustion, changing weather, and silence into part of the pilgrimage itself. The international reach is expanding too. In 2025, the Jasna, Góra Information Center served more than 102,000 pilgrims and tourists in nearly 5,000 organized groups from 78 countries. Its guided services also increased significantly compared with the previous year. Jasna, Góra gives us an important first clue. Catholic pilgrimage is not growing through one single formula. Sometimes the strongest evidence is found in millions of people returning to a sacred place. Sometimes it is found in thousands of people choosing the harder road, walking for days simply to reach their destination. And as the pilgrimage map continues to change, the next destination reveals an entirely different kind of growth. Number 9. Medjugorje, Bosnia, and Herzegovina. Medjugorje is one of those places where the most important number is not found outside the church, but inside it. While much of the world was still struggling to restore international travel after the pandemic, something much quieter was beginning to accelerate here. Pilgrims were returning to Mass, confession, Eucharistic worship, prayer, and spiritual retreats. And the evidence can be measured in what they actually came to do. In 2019, Medjugorje recorded about 1.825 million Holy Communions. During the pandemic, that number collapsed to roughly 381,000 in 2020. Then the recovery began. By 2022, the figure had climbed above 1.5 million. In 2023, it passed 1.73 million. In 2024, it crossed 2 million. Then, in 2025, Medjugorje recorded approximately 2.02 million Holy Communions, surpassing its pre-pandemic figure. That change matters because it reveals something that a simple visitor count cannot capture. People were not merely returning to see the landscape or visit a famous religious destination. They were participating in the sacramental life of the shrine. In 2025 alone, more than 47,000 priests celebrated masses in Medjugorje, another indication of how many international pilgrimage groups continued to arrive. The story becomes even more significant because Medjugorje has never been an ordinary pilgrimage destination. Its history has been surrounded by intense debate, and the Vatican has maintained a careful distinction between permitting forms of devotion and confirming the supernatural authenticity of the alleged apparitions. Yet pilgrimage activity has continued, and the focus on prayer, confession, Mass, and Eucharistic worship remains central to the experience of those who come. That gives Medjugorje a different kind of momentum. Its growth is not simply about bigger crowds filling streets. It is about what happens after pilgrims arrive, and the numbers suggest that many are participating deeply in the religious life of the shrine. But if Medjugorje reveals growth through sacramental participation, the next destination will reveal it on a completely different scale. Number 8. Santiago de Compostela, Spain. One road can begin with a single pair of worn shoes and end with 500,000 people arriving at the same cathedral. Somewhere between those 2 points, something remarkable happens. Strangers who started their journeys in different countries begin sharing meals, walking through the same villages, sleeping under the same roofs, and carrying stories they rarely would have encountered at home. The destination is Santiago de Compostela, but for many pilgrims, the transformation begins long before they can see the cathedral. The Camino de Santiago was severely disrupted when international travel collapsed during the pandemic. Yet the silence did not last. Pilgrims returned to the roots, and the movement grew rapidly. In 2025, more than 500,000 pilgrims received the Compostela, placing Santiago at the center of one of the largest pilgrimage movements in the world. The remarkable part is that there is no single starting point. The Camino is a vast network of routes stretching across Spain, Portugal, France, and beyond. Some pilgrims walk for several days. Others spend weeks crossing mountains, forests, villages, and open countryside with everything they need carried on their backs. Every morning begins with movement, and every evening brings another temporary community of people who may have been complete strangers only hours earlier. The international character of the Camino has become impossible to miss. Pilgrims arrive from across Europe, North America, Latin America, Asia, and many other parts of the world. Young adults walk beside older travelers. Families share sections of the route with lifelong pilgrims. Some come because of Catholic devotion. Others begin with curiosity and discover that the physical journey has opened a much deeper spiritual question. That is where Santiago becomes more than a famous cathedral. The growth is happening across an entire pilgrimage network, turning thousands of individual journeys into one enormous movement toward a single sacred destination. The road itself has become part of the experience, and its revival suggests that modern pilgrims are not necessarily looking for an easier way to reach a holy place. Many are choosing the longer way, the slower way, and sometimes the harder way. But the next destination reveals what happens when this renewed hunger for pilgrimage leaves the roads behind and gathers into one extraordinary place. Number 7. Our Lady of Guadalupe, Mexico. By the time the sun rises over Mexico City on December 12, many of the people surrounding the basilica have already been moving for hours, sometimes for days. Some arrive on foot with worn shoes and tired faces. Others come in caravans, carrying flowers, banners, candles, and images of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Roads that normally carry millions of vehicles become corridors of pilgrims, while police, medical teams, volunteers, and parish groups prepare for a human tide that has become one of the largest annual religious gatherings in the world. In 2025, roughly 13 million people gathered around the basilica during the days surrounding the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The scale is difficult to absorb because this is not a crowd arriving for a single concert or sporting event. These pilgrims come in waves throughout the day and night from communities across Mexico and from beyond the country. Many travel long distances simply to reach the shrine, and some make the journey as an act of thanksgiving or in fulfillment of a personal promise. That promise can make the journey intensely personal. A mother may carry a child through the crowds. A family may walk together because a loved one recovered from illness. An older pilgrim may return to the basilica after decades of making the same journey. Others arrive carrying the names of people who could not make the trip themselves. Among millions of bodies moving toward one sanctuary, each person can be carrying a completely different reason for being there. Then the infrastructure begins to reveal the true scale. Highways require special operations. Medical stations are expanded. Security teams prepare for enormous crowds. Volunteers guide exhausted pilgrims through streets that have temporarily become part of the pilgrimage itself. The basilica becomes less like an isolated church and more like the center of a vast moving network connecting families, communities, parishes, and entire regions of Mexico. That is the remarkable part of Guadalupe. Its growth cannot be separated from the culture surrounding the pilgrimage. The tradition renews itself because people keep bringing other people into it. Children come with parents. Young adults return with friends. Communities organize together. And year after year, the same destination pulls another immense generation of pilgrims toward its doors. The next site on our list takes that momentum into Europe, where a different kind of pilgrimage is producing numbers that are becoming increasingly difficult to overlook. Number 6. Lourdes, France. At Lourdes, the crowds are not the first thing you notice. It is the people who need help reaching the grotto. Wheelchairs move through the sanctuary. Volunteers walk beside sick pilgrims, and families stay close as they make their way toward the place where generations have come to pray. Then the pandemic brought that entire world almost to a standstill. In 2019, Lourdes recorded about 445,000 pilgrims in organized groups. 1 year later, that number collapsed to roughly 35,000. For a sanctuary that had welcomed pilgrims from around the world for generations, the sudden emptiness was extraordinary. Then the movement returned. Organized pilgrimages reached 100,000 in 2021, 175,000 in 2022, 370,000 in 2023, and 410,000 in 2024. Independent pilgrims and visitors climbed from 1.6 million to 3.2 million over the same period. Yet Lourdes is not defined by crowds alone. Its international pilgrimage network is built around dioceses, parishes, families, volunteers, and organizations that bring the sick and elderly into the center of the experience. As those groups returned, the familiar scenes of service returned with them. Wheelchairs moved through the sanctuary again. Volunteers waited beside the sick. Families gathered around those who could no longer make the journey alone. For a place shaped so deeply by human vulnerability, that return carries a weight that no attendance figure can fully capture. The numbers tell us that Lourdes is recovering. The people walking slowly toward the grotto tell us what that recovery actually looks like. Number 5. Fatima, Portugal. Something has changed at Fatima, and you can see it on the map. The crowds returning to this Portuguese shrine are no longer coming from quite the same places they did before the pandemic. New pilgrimage groups are arriving from farther away, and countries that once played a smaller role are becoming increasingly visible among the millions who come here. The numbers behind that shift are remarkable. Fatima welcomed around 6.5 million people in 2025, surpassing the roughly 6.3 million recorded in 2019. That came after a turbulent recovery, including an exceptional 6.8 million in 2023, when World Youth Day in Lisbon and Pope Francis visiting Fatima brought extraordinary additional crowds. But 2025 revealed something more lasting. Pilgrimage groups arrived from 84 countries, while Asia accounted for 22.3% of the total and became the second largest continental source of pilgrims. Indonesia and Vietnam were among the 10 countries sending the most pilgrims to Fatima. The familiar images have not changed. The Chapel of the Apparitions still draws people into prayer. The Rosary Basilica still dominates the sanctuary. At night, thousands of candles can still transform the square into a sea of light. Yet behind those familiar scenes, the geography is changing. Fatima is becoming more international, not simply because more people are returning, but because more parts of the world are becoming part of its pilgrimage story. The shrine remains rooted in Portugal, but the people filling its grounds increasingly come from a much wider Catholic world. Number 4. Rome, Italy. For most of the year, Rome belongs to tourists, commuters, residents, and the millions who come to see its ancient streets. Then the Jubilee arrived, and the rhythm of the city changed. Streets that normally lead toward monuments became pilgrimage routes. Churches became stopping points. Ancient basilicas filled with people carrying crosses, prayer books, and Jubilee passes, while the holy doors became destinations in their own right. The transformation reached a scale few cities could absorb quietly. During the Jubilee of 2025, nearly 33.5 million pilgrims came to Rome from 185 countries, exceeding the original projection of around 31 million. More than 500,000 had already crossed the holy door of St. Peter's Basilica within the first 2 weeks. Then, Rome received an unexpected surge of energy from another generation. More than 1 million young people from 146 countries gathered for the Jubilee of Young People. They filled the streets, churches, public spaces, and pilgrimage routes, turning the Eternal City into a temporary meeting place for young Catholics from across the world. The Jubilee was not concentrated in one weekend. Pilgrims arrived throughout the year, moving between basilicas, crossing Rome on foot, attending liturgies, visiting holy doors, and joining organized groups from their own countries. The city became a constantly shifting network of small pilgrimages, each one feeding into the larger movement. By the time the Jubilee ended, Rome had experienced something unusual. Its ancient religious landmarks had not simply attracted another wave of visitors. They had become active destinations within a worldwide pilgrimage movement, with millions moving through the city for a shared spiritual purpose. For a place that has watched empires rise and disappear, the sight of millions walking toward its churches created a striking reminder that some journeys never really go out of fashion. Number 3. Basilica of the National Shrine of Our Lady of Aparecida, Brazil. The pilgrimage is getting bigger, but something else is changing at the same time. At Aparecida, the road to the shrine is revealing a new kind of pilgrim. Families are arriving in their own cars, smaller groups are traveling independently, and millions are still making the journey to one of the largest Catholic sanctuaries in the world. In 2025, Aparecida welcomed more than 10,400,000 devotees, about 15% more than the previous year. That alone would make the shrine remarkable, but the vehicles arriving at the sanctuary reveal a deeper change. Compared with 2019, private vehicles using the shrine parking areas increased by about 17%, while tourism buses declined by roughly 22%. The pilgrimage is becoming more personal. Around 90% of the vehicles arriving in 2025 were private cars carrying up to 5 people. Instead of relying primarily on large organized groups, more families and smaller groups are choosing when to leave, how to travel, and how long to stay. The destination has remained the same, but the journey is being reshaped around the people making it. Then the major celebrations arrive, and the scale suddenly explodes. On October 12, the Feast of Our Lady of Aparecida drew more than 152,000 devotees in a single day. Across the novena and feast period, nearly 500,000 people came to the shrine. Yet the most interesting part is the contrast. Aparecida is growing through an ancient devotion while adapting to modern patterns of travel. The enormous basilica remains the destination. The feast remains deeply rooted in Brazilian Catholic life, and families continue to return year after year. But the roads leading there are carrying a different pattern of movement, one built increasingly around individual families and smaller groups. That tension between tradition and change gives Aparecida its unique momentum. The pilgrimage has not become less traditional because the way people travel has changed. Instead, An old pilgrimage is finding new ways to move through a modern country. Number 2. The Holy Land. For a Catholic pilgrim, the Holy Land is different from almost anywhere else on earth. The journey moves through places whose names are already familiar from the Gospel, from Nazareth and Bethlehem to the Sea of Galilee and Jerusalem. For decades, that connection drew hundreds of thousands of Christian pilgrims each year. Then, almost overnight, the movement was interrupted. Before the pandemic, Israel received roughly 500,000 Christian pilgrims annually, with Catholic groups forming a major part of the organized pilgrimage traffic. The pandemic brought that movement to a near standstill. Then, the war that began in October 2023 created another devastating interruption, leaving pilgrimage routes, hotels, guides, and local Christian businesses facing an unprecedented collapse in visitors. Yet the story is no longer defined only by absence. Pilgrimage organizations have been preparing for renewed travel. Churches have continued welcoming visitors where conditions allow, and new pilgrimage sites and routes have been developed. The recovery is uneven and remains vulnerable to the security situation. But the infrastructure and international networks that once carried pilgrims through the Holy Land are still being rebuilt. That matters because pilgrimage here has consequences far beyond the visitor count. A returning group does not simply fill a hotel or enter a church. It reconnects with local guides, religious communities, schools, businesses, and Christian families whose lives remain tied to the pilgrimage economy. When pilgrims return, an entire network begins moving again. The geography makes that return especially powerful. A pilgrimage through the Holy Land can connect Nazareth, Galilee, Bethlehem, and Jerusalem within one journey, turning the landscape itself into part of the experience. These are not places that can be fully understood through photographs. The distance between them has to be crossed, the churches have to be entered, and the landscape has to be experienced on foot. That is the real growth story here. The Holy Land is not being presented as a destination already breaking attendance records. Its significance lies in the scale of the pilgrimage network waiting to move again after years of disruption. When international pilgrims return in greater numbers, they will not simply be coming back to a destination. They will be reconnecting with a living Catholic presence that has been waiting for them. Number 1. The Paris to Chartres pilgrimage, France. They could have taken a train. They could have arrived in a few hours. Instead, thousands of young Catholics choose to walk more than 60 miles from Paris to Chartres, carrying backpacks, sleeping along the route, praying together, and continuing through heat, rain, fatigue, and aching feet. For 3 days, the easiest way to reach the destination is deliberately rejected. That choice has been attracting more people. Around 16,000 pilgrims took part in 2023. The number rose to roughly 18,000 in 2024, then passed 19,000 in 2025. Registration filled rapidly, turning an ancient pilgrimage into one of the most visible signs of renewed Catholic participation among young adults in France. But the real story begins after the excitement wears off. Hours of walking separate the pilgrims from ordinary routines. Phones become less important. Conversations become deeper. Groups that began as strangers gradually become communities, sharing food, carrying one another's belongings, praying together, and encouraging those who are struggling to keep moving. Then comes the final approach to Chartres. The towers of the cathedral appear in the distance, and the exhaustion that has accumulated over 3 days suddenly has a destination. Pilgrims enter the city on foot, carrying the physical memory of every mile behind them. The journey has demanded something from them before they ever reach the altar. That is what makes this growth so different. The pilgrimage is not becoming popular because it has been made easier, faster, or more comfortable. Its appeal is moving in the opposite direction. Young people are choosing effort over convenience and community over isolation, and thousands more are joining them each year. After a period when many assumed younger generations were losing interest in traditional Catholic practices, the road from Paris to Chartres offers a strikingly different image. The growing crowds are not being carried toward the destination. They are carrying themselves there, one step at a time. What began as a journey of faith has become something much larger. Across Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, and beyond, Catholic pilgrimage is finding new momentum after years of disruption. Some shrines are seeing millions return. Others are attracting new generations, new countries, and new forms of pilgrimage. The most striking part is that growth does not always look the same. Sometimes it appears in crowded basilicas, sometimes in a family arriving by car, a sick pilgrim being pushed toward a grotto, or thousands of young people choosing to walk for days when they could have taken the easier route. These places are not simply becoming busier. They are becoming meeting points between an ancient Catholic tradition and a generation searching for faith, meaning, community, and something worth walking toward. Thank you for joining us on this journey through 10 Catholic pilgrimage sites, experiencing remarkable renewed momentum. If you enjoyed discovering the stories behind these places, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more journeys through Catholic history, culture, faith, and sacred places around the world.